Back in my day, there was this thing called the Rubik's Cube. It was a puzzle that you twisted and turned to get all the colors to one side and to make a beautiful pattern where all the colors aligned. And it seemed like no matter how you twisted or turned, it would just lead to utter frustration and seemed impossible to solve. It seemed like almost that you needed to be a magician and have a magic trick to do it. However, what you discovered was that there was a pattern, that there was a system into doing it. And once you learned that pattern and system, it would take you mere seconds to solve. And you would never have to use anything else to do it. It could be jumbled as much as possible, and still, if you use the system, you'll solve it. In writing, there's something similar called the 3-act structure. The 3-act structure is a system that's designed to help you tell your story. Most stories, if not all, have a 3-act structure. It's the how you get to the 3-act structure that's the interesting part in writing, because not everybody does it the same. There are many methods that you can use to get to the 3-act structure, and that is what this show is about, as we take a look at how you develop your own 3-act structure that works for you.
Hey guys, I am Katie Salidas. I am an urban fantasy and paranormal romance author with 6 book series under my belt and more to come. I'm also the host and producer of the Spilling Ink Show and a publishing consultant with Rising Sign Books.
Hi guys, I'm David Whalen, the owner of Correct Handed Comics. I have multiple titles out, an ongoing 4-issue miniseries, multiple one-shots out, and graphic novels out, and my first book, The Last Ride to Tyburn, a Western that came out about 2 years ago that I'm still plugging away on selling almost every week. And have a new book coming out at the end of this month called I Won't Stop.
I am Megan Morgan. I am a sci-fi fantasy author. My first book is The Altered Wake, and I am currently finishing up The Altered Rise. And since then, I've contributed to the anthology In the Blink of an Eye, as has Erik Kristopher Myers, because it's based on his movie.
Yes, I'm Erik Kristopher Myers. I'm an independent filmmaker. I made the features Roulette and Butterfly Kisses. Both are streaming on Prime and available in physical media. I am also a writer for Ain't It Cool News, where typically my contributions are on the subject of genre theory and franchise history.
Hey guys, I'm Alexander Gideon. I'm a historical fantasy, urban fantasy, dark fantasy, sci-fi writer. First book in the Books of the Law series, The Web of Crimson, came out back in April. I'm currently slogging through the incredibly long edits of the second book. Also a short story author. I'm in several anthologies, most of them from Zombies Need Brains. My writing style can best be summed up by the phrase, and many people died.
Probably, arguably, the most complex and daunting part of the 3-act structure, the second act, the middle, which I've been told by a lot of people is the dreaded middle, or the slogging middle, or whatever you want, whatever adjective you want to add to it. And so I'm curious for everybody here, just to start with, how you approach it. Is it the thing that you dread the most? Is it the one that you appreciate? Where are you at when it comes to the second act?
You know, I personally think the middle should be more fun. It shouldn't be something you dread to write, because you're doing all of the trial and error. Yes, you're building the characters up, but you're also showing the hero or the protagonist of your story going through a lot of trials, a lot of conflict. And conflict is interesting. It's the first act where you're doing more of the introductions that shouldn't. It tends to be slower because you're doing a lot more world building and introduction. So that second act should be a lot of fun to write. You know, lots of conflict, lots of, beating your characters up, a lot of failures that they have to overcome.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that for me, the middle is always the meat and the bones, where you can get in that characterization. You can get in those parts in where you really get to know who the character is. You really get to know the pros and the cons of what that character's doing and why they're doing it. And you can really, for me, the beginning part, like, we were saying, the beginning part is almost daunting. It's how do you get to the fun stuff? And how do you get there in an interesting way? So once you get to the fun stuff, then it's just all uphill from there, trying to show all the good and the bad of your character, the good and the bad of the situation that they're in, and how to be able to resolve that situation.
I like that you said uphill, because literally in the 3-act structure, it's
Yeah.
right up the hill.
It's part of the roller coaster.
I might have planned that. I might have had that planned in my pocket and ready to go.
It's the part of the roller coaster that I love the most, but everybody seems to dislike. But
Yeah, I don't get that. I don't understand the popular conception, or I mean, I'd say a misconception that the second act is the hardest to write, or has the most pitfalls, because it really comes down to, are you trying to write a concept, or are you trying to tell a story? And if you know exactly, hey, I got this slam bang way to introduce this world and introduce these characters, and then I got this great ending where, this happens and blah, blah, and then there's this whole vast chasm in between. You've come up with an idea. You're not telling a story. The where it ends should be a natural progression of everything that happens in the middle or in Act 2. Just this horrible, rigid structure of how stories are told, rather than just telling a story, sitting there like trying to build a skeleton and then lay all the characters and the situations on top of the skeleton, instead of just telling a story that fits within the sort of page count or conventions of a 3-act story. You were going to say something.
Oh my goodness. No, I'm just sitting here listening to you. And I'm one of those people for whom the middle section is insanely difficult to get through for me. Complete and total opposite. My beginning, for me, the way I mentally visualize a story is that it's pinched on both ends. And then the middle is where everything kind of starts to blow up, because that's usually when you're sort of going out into the world and different plot threads and stuff are coming in. And that's where I have a tendency to get lost. And that's worse when I'm pantsing than when I lay a story out. I have done both. I've both pantsed and done a layout. And when I pants by the middle, I'm I don't know what's going on anymore. I'm lost. And I have to just kind of wade through it. And then at the end, when I come back and edit, that's when I tighten up that middle section. But yeah, when I plot out, I feel my middle just sort of rolls, but everything else isn't as good.
Interesting.
Yeah. The middle is very hard for me, which is why I did not initially sign up to do this specific show, because the middle is my least favorite section to write.
She just nailed that right there. It's too many things going on that creates the saggy middle.
Yes.
It's the need to trim it down and to refocus that creates that nice streamlined second act. But initially, yeah, it's going to be overbloated with too much information. And that's all it is. It's just too much. You've got to trim it back down.
I can definitely see why the second act would be one of the hardest for a lot of people, because honestly, when you look at a book, the second act is probably the most important part of the book. If you look at movie trailers, most of what you see in a movie trailer comes from the middle of the movie, that second act. A reference book that I swear by, Save the Cat. One of my favorites. I use it especially for the novellas, just because they have to be so streamlined, because you have such an economy of words that you're working with, that you've got to hit those beats in the right order. And of course, you can play with them, but I mean, one of the most important sections in the entire thing is one that in Save the Cat, Blake Snyder calls fun and games. And when he talks about it, it's the promise of the premise. So it's basically when you read the back matter of a book and you're reading that whole description, all of that, when you get excited about it, you're I really want to read this book. It's that middle part that you're really looking forward to. That's going to give all of that action, all of that, characterization. You start your B stories, have that really solid midpoint. You set up your ending. Pulling all of that in can be really difficult to connect those first and third acts.
It seems like we're coming from different disciplines. Some of us are authors, some of us are filmmakers, some of us are comic book artists and storytellers, where the structure is different. sort of dependent upon each medium. And like, so for example, maybe Save the Cat works for you telling short stories or long form fiction. I hate it as a screenwriter, book. And not that it's wrong about, you know, story construction. I think it's when you start trying to follow the rules to a super OCD meticulous degree that the charm of storytelling is lost. At that point, you know, you're sort of assembling something, and it takes a lot of the magic out of the process. You're packaging a product.
Yeah, well, for me as a comic book writer and artist, it can vary, because I have one shots out that are 24 pages. I have 100+ page graphic novels. I have 4-issue miniseries out, and I have an ongoing series. So I always have to kind of reel myself in and remind myself, oh, I've got 24 pages to tell the story. What is the best way to tell? What are the meat and bones? What's the way to be able to get people to understand my character quickly, the character's problem, and how they get to the conclusion of, especially in a 24-page one-shot. But in something like my ongoing series, The Offspring, where we just had issue 13 come out last month, it's fun because I have individual stories inside issues. So if I have a story that's lasting 2 issues, I know I've got to make sure that I am telling the individual story inside those 2 issues, but also propelling forward the larger story arc that I'm trying to get done in 50 issues. So I not only have to give the characterization, make sure I explain why that character is doing what they're doing and the problem that they're having, but I also have to continue moving forward a bigger story arc that's going to make sense in 25, 30, 40 issues. So for me, it's very much juggling the idea of what's this main story I'm telling for these 2, 3, or 4 issues, and then how can I push the story forward to be able to tell my bigger, broader story, and not have the characters change and grow throughout, but not have them change so much that it messes up my overall story that I'm trying to tell, or how do they change so much that it leads to the overall story that I'm trying to tell.
I like the idea of Save the Cat, and while I don't follow their structure rigidly, I've seen the beat structure, especially for authors of pretty much all genres, be, you know, condensed to a couple of beats and expanded to hundreds of beats, depending on how much of an outliner you are. And I think as a structure, as a framework, it's not bad because it does help you focus on where your story should be in each individual act. It doesn't provide you the exact blueprint of what to do, but it's a good guideline. For me, as a pantser, I tend to use it as a double check at the end. So I write my story as a pantser, and then I go back and I kind of look at the beats and see, am I hitting some of these, you know, specific points at certain areas in the story? And if they line up, great. Sometimes it shows me that I need to add a little more, or I need to remove some things, because again, with the saggy middle, it's focusing, it's condensing down when you have too much so that you keep that action streamline going up the hill.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I'm not saying that something like Save the Cat doesn't have value. I've read it. I've read the books that came out of it. I went through a film program, and we had to overstudy a lot of this stuff. And you overstudy it to a point where it saps out a lot of the intuition that a writer should have when creating a story, or it makes you second guess perhaps what you're coming up with in the moment. I'm a pantser as well. I know you're not a pantser. And
I'm a pantser. Mostly.
You think you're a pantser?
I am a pantser, yes.
Interesting.
I outlined like 1 of my books, and I won't ever do it again.
Okay. Well, all right. Whatever the case, we all approach the storytelling differently. And, you know, I have a very specific way I do it. I think that most of us do have specific ways we approach storytelling. I just sort of feel that going to a guidebook is not the best way to go through the creative process. At that point, anybody can be a writer. It's just assembling sort of words. You know, there's nothing creative about it at all if it's following a very specific, agreed upon conventional structure. Then it's the same story over and over again.
Well, and there's that old philosophy of everything that's already written has already been written. We're just telling it different ways. I think that for you and I, for the pantsers, we definitely can't have a hard structure to work from, because it saps the creativity. I tried doing outlining, and I absolutely hated the writing process because of that. But on the other hand, there are some writers out there who need it. They can't function without having that outline, that directive. And for them, that's probably a good thing.
So that being said, there's certain aspects of the second act that need to be apparent, and there's the goal, the time lock, the B stories, the digging deeper, the hurdles, and then of course the big disaster and conflict, and that is what sets us up for the third act. And which device do you guys like to use to bring in that middle part?
I think that very often for me in the second act, a lot of what's happening is usually the characters sort of like second guessing their actions in the first act and trying to figure out, okay, like that's where I fucked everything up last time around. Now, how do I fix it? And then in the middle of that, of course, you have, sort of this moment where like your characters are simultaneously dealing with failure, and then like more failure or more disaster comes. Mm-hmm. So that for me is usually, what is going on in the middle. And then I also like to be kind of pulling characters apart and figuring out like what are the little surprises here, like inside these people that we're talking about. I think it's sort of the moment when you're like pulling back the bowstring and you're aiming at like the third act. And you gotta like get your aim on. You still have to be keeping your eye on that moment, and yet somehow sort of spiraling out away from it in a way that you can come back.
So, follow-up question, Megan: when you have those issues, when that happens to you, is it because you already have the third act already in mind? Do you know what's going to happen at the end? Is it something that you've already created, or is it getting to that point and then you're worried that it might change that, or are you trying to figure out what it is that it's going to be?
Very often, and this is definitely where like Erik and I are different in that usually when I start a story, I begin with a character, whereas Erik is usually beginning with a concept. So I'm usually starting with character first, and then the concept sort of grows out of that. And so very often I will have like sort of at least the vaguest idea of the ending in mind, just because I've sort of like figured out who the characters are, and I know what is going to be the most impactful to them at the end of the story should all go well.
Well, for me, I like to go back to my 12-year-old self and do the choose your own adventure. Because a lot of times I'll have 4 or 5, 6 or 7 books in the queue ready to go. I've got them plotted out. I've done all the thumbnails. I've done all the storyboarding. I've done everything. I know the story that I want to tell, and I know that I've got 2 or 3 months working on other stories. So every once in a while I'll go back to it and I'll say, I like this spot right here, but what's something else that character could possibly do? What kind of person do I want this to be? Is he the hero? Is she the villain? Is she, are they making good choices and making bad choices? And how do the people around them react to that? So there'll be a lot of times I'll think I'll have it down, and then I'll think to myself, what else can I do? Just see if I can really, like we talked about, the meat on the bones, really get everything out of this story, especially if it's a one shot where I only have 24 to 25 pages to be able to tell it. So for me, it's kind of stepping back from that very structured, this is the story that I'm telling. And if there's been times where I thought I had a great ending, and then I go back into like 10 pages, 11 pages into it, and I think, well, what if this character did this? And it would completely change everything that I did, but it would make it better. It's that gray area in between. So if I've got a superhero type character, I want to be able to see those gray areas. I want to be able to see those characters at their worst and at their best, hopefully.
And you're okay if that changes your ending?
Yeah, if it's better.
There's often the expectation that there's going to be a cliffhanger at the end of 1 to 2 to 3 or something to that effect, or one of them is going to have a cliffhanger at some point in there. Is that something you're thinking about too when you're putting that second act through? Are you thinking about this is going to be where my cliffhanger should be?
Yeah, 100%. I love the cliffhanger at the end of the book. I almost maybe dwell on it or maybe not give it too much thought, because you never give it too much thought. But I always try to make sure that I'm where I need to be by the time I've gotten the big meat and we're honing in on the climax, that I'm where I need to be, or adjusting that big reveal moment at the end to rope those people back into issue 13 that I just put out. It's funny because talking about going back and having something better, I had a character that I knew what I wanted to do with them in the future, but I didn't really key into it. I really didn't let the readers know that there was more to this character. So I had wrapped up the story, and there was a pretty good I had a pretty good cliffhanger. And then I realized I can do 2 more pages with this character, and I can have a cliffhanger on top of a cliffhanger.
It's all about the drama. You know, people like drama. What is drama? It's conflict. It's conflict within yourself. It's conflict within the people around you, the characters that you're dealing with. It's the conflict against the, monster, whether it's the monster in the story or a monster of an idea or a government or whatever the antagonist is. So it's all about the conflict that happens on your way to that climactic moment. That's the entirety of that section, the second act.
How do you like to get to there, though, Katie? What is it that you like to use to get to that idea?
Well, if you think of it as a journey, there's usually the protagonist, but that's not all about them. They have a team or an inner circle or people that help them along the way. And so there's always going to be drama points when you deal with other people. So I focus on the journey getting to that end point and what happens and what conflicts arise every time that they have to call on somebody, bring somebody onto the team. How are they getting to that point, and what are the problems that happen on each step of the way?
The thing that I've always focused on is that, and it's why I brought it up when I was talking about Save the Cat, is that the fun and game section, which when you read Save the Cat, it's only like this one section and then you're done with it. And I think that was one of the most important parts, and that honestly it lasts the entire second act. Like the second Crowley book, I don't have a back matter for it yet because we're still in edits, but basically the whole thing is that there is this vault that holds this certain artifact that they're trying to get through or trying to get to, and it's within this vast labyrinth that's got all these monsters and everything in it. And so the whole fun and game section is that second act of them being in this labyrinth, trying to get through it, fighting monsters. And, that's what you want to see, because you're like, I want to see Aleister Crowley fight these monsters. But these fights and these monsters go from the beginning of the second act all the way to the end of it, where you're leading into your climax in your third act.
Is it because of the nature of that there's so much more to the second act? Like Eric said, it's 50% of what the story is. If you're following this 3-act structure, 25, 50, 25, which is, basically what everybody will end up following, even if you're not following it. Is this the most important element of your storytelling in terms of what you're going to tell?
See, that's a trick question, because if you don't have a good introduction, people aren't going to get past the first few pages. If you don't have a good second act, people are going to get bored and they're not going to finish the story. If you don't stick the landing in the third, people aren't going to be satisfied. So you can't say one is more important than the other. They all have to work together. You have to spend time on each one.
I disagree. I think you need to have a very strong opening, but openings are sort of by their nature going to be more interesting. They're going to be more intriguing. You are setting up a world or a mystery or a problem or whatever that is, and people are at least willing to give you a couple pages or give you a couple minutes or a couple of whatever. But the point where most people put a book down or stop watching a TV show or a movie is right there when it started to get boring in the middle. And that you see that happen more often than not, and at least that's been my experience. And I've had to read a lot of student scripts and some great beginnings that go straight into endings, and that's largely because, I mean, again, it's a question of does this product have a story or is it all concept? And you can very easily tell the difference between the two. And I can find it in my own writing. There have been plenty of times where I've hit the midway point and I literally don't know where to go. At which point I realized I came up with a really cool idea. I didn't come up with a cool story.
I think sometimes, as someone who reads a lot of, epic fantasy, even high fantasy, some of those really long, spider killers, that first act can be really, really slow. But it's a build because you have this giant world that's being set. Sometimes it's interesting in that you've got all of this history and everything that you're kind of working through, and you're setting up that, hey, there's this war that you have to know all of this history about to really understand why it's happening, and we've got 20 characters to introduce, and your opening is just kind of going along, and I can get through that. And I'm fine with that, especially as long as I'm, it's not too slow. I can deal with a slower opening. But if I hit that second act and we're still doing this and we're still really slow and we haven't really done anything more, or I haven't really connected with these characters and everything, by about the midpoint, I'm definitely not going to get through. So I really think that second act, I agree with Eric that the second act is the most important part of the book, because it is your story. It is the main part of your story.
You guys are giving way too much credit to people who have been reading for a long time and who are used to the old way. Today's Netflix generation does not have time to wait to get to a second act. They will DNF a book. You look at all the booktubers out there. If it doesn't pick them up right at the beginning.
For me, one of the parts that throws me off on a book or a movie or TV show, if we're way into the second act and a character makes a decision that is completely the opposite of what any decision that character has made before that, and that the character or the writer has the character make that decision just to move the plot forward, for me, that's one of the reasons why the first act is so important. Because if you have a character, a group of characters, and you want to know who those people are, for me, that's what it is. Getting to know these people, so you feel like you care about them. You feel like you want to get invested in who they are. So if they're really great people or really good people or really bad people or somewhere in between, you at least know who they are, whether you want to root for them or you want to hope that it does not work out for them in the end.
I was on the first 10 pages show, and I think I said there that that's a point where I'll spend a lot of time nitpicking over words and shaving things down and making sure everything is real clean and real quick. The middle is a completely different story when it comes to editing. The middle for me is so much harder to edit, and it's where I probably spend the most brain power editing, because the middle for me, I have a tendency to kind of try out 2 or 3 different middles, and I have to cut a couple of them when I come back through. Stories are kind of at this point like a chess game. So the beginnings of most chess games are sort of formulaic, and the ends of most chess games are sort of formulaic. It's this smaller middle section, although in the book it's pretty big. There's this middle section where anything can happen. And so I think that that's sort of part of the reason why the middle is doing so much work, and is that so much story is actually happening there, because your beginnings and your endings are to a certain sense predetermined and locked down in a certain structural way and from certain audience expectations based off of genre. At the end of a romance novel, the couple has to get together and they have to live happily ever after. That's the end of every romance novel. That's just how it is. If they don't get together and live happily ever after at the end, it's not a romance novel anymore. And so, but the middle, that is the point in a romance novel where are they going to go to a deserted island and she's going to fall in love with this person who she hated at the beginning? Is she going to discover that her fiance is a terrible man and she's actually in love with this guy? In the middle, lots of things can happen. The end, certain things have to happen. And so
the guy doesn't tend to die.
And romance novels?
Yeah.
No.
It feels like the tragic romance would be the more the you want to read about.
That's romance is so formulaic.
That's a romantic drama that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Romance novel. Everybody has to live and everybody has to.
So Nicholas Sparks is not
Sparks is
romance.
not a
No, he's not.
You write love tragedies.
I think that Eric doesn't entirely realize how rigidly structured he is in his writing. I don't think I've ever met anyone who writes the way that you do, with sort of like page limits on like your acts, where you expect to be reaching a resolution at age, like 17 or 18, and then you expect Act 2 to be ending at a certain page count also. I don't know anyone else who writes like that. Like, I've never met anyone who writes with it, like the acts precisely planned like that.
I write like that too, actually.
I write like that also.